The thing you have to understand about the new policy that President Trump discussed is it really is an entirely new policy. It's not a nuclear policy. It's not a non-nuclear policy. It's a comprehensive policy. And more than anything else, this is what the Trump administration, Trump officials, the journalists who have talked to them have tried to explain. The idea that they have is, and they're right, is that under the Obama administration, everything about Iran was subordinated to the Iran deal. So it wasn't, the Obama administration had a strategy, but it was all about preserving the nuclear deal. So they looked the other way at everything from Iranian expansionism to ballistic missile development to Assad's atrocities in Syria, because they wanted to avoid confrontation with Iran in order to preserve the deal. The Trump administration said, first of all, that is a misguided policy. But more importantly, structurally, there's an enormous problem with the idea that U.S. policy toward Iran should be all about the nuclear deal. And in fact, what they set out to do was to make the nuclear deal, whatever their policy on the nuclear deal is, before we even get to what the president discussed specific to the nuclear deal or where Congress is, before we get to the specifics, what they wanted to do explicitly, intentionally, is make the nuclear deal just another element of our broader concerns toward Iran. And that, more than anything else, is this framework that people have to have when they begin to try to understand what it is that happened, which was a major policy change. It's that in addition to the specific policies, and we'll talk about the specific policies, there was a structural change where instead of the nuclear deal being the most important thing, and in fact being the only important thing, there are a range of concerns they have. And that's the initial framework before we get to what the specific policies were. Once people understand that, we can begin discussing the specifics of the nuclear policy and the specifics of the non-nuclear policy as a comprehensive whole. So the one that got all the attention was what the president said about the nuclear deal. Now, according to congressional law going back to 2015, every 90 days, the president has to certify to Congress, literally say yes or no, about a set of 4.5 questions that are written into what's called the INARA law, the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. This was, by the way, the same law that triggered the review process that got so much attention in late 2015. And part of that law, and this is a law, this is something that the president has to do. It was passed by Congress at the time, it was signed by then President Obama. The law says the president has to, every 90 days, tell Congress whether these 4.5 conditions remain true. And some of the conditions are specific to the nuclear deal. So the second condition, for instance, asks if Iran has committed a material breach of the nuclear deal. The third condition asks if Iran has made covert progress toward a nuclear weapon. Those are specific to the nuclear deal. But when Congress wrote the law, they weren't really only interested in the nuclear deal. What they were asking was a broader question. And what they really wanted to know every 90 days is the deal still worth it? Given the totality of everything, is the deal still worth it? And every 90 days, the president has to tell them whether or not it's worth it. And we already talked about the second and the third conditions, but it's the first and the fourth conditions that always got the most attention. The first condition asked whether the Iranians were fully, transparently and verifiably implementing the agreement and all related agreements. Because Congress didn't just want to know about whether or not the nuclear deal was being implemented. They wanted to know the nuclear deal and everything else. Because it could be, Congress thought at the time, that if the Iranians are fully implementing the nuclear deal but not related agreements, then maybe it's not worth it anymore. And they wanted to know that for themselves. And the fourth condition that the president had to say yes or no to every 90 days was whether or not sanctions relief provided by the deal remained appropriate and proportional to Iranian actions, and whether it was vital to America's national interest. Because again, they weren't just asking, is Iran complying with the deal? They were asking, is the deal still worth it? And what the president said was, no. Sanctions relief is not appropriate and proportionate to Iranian actions. Because, not just because the Iranians are, at best, grudgingly complying with the deal, not just because the Iranians are pushing the envelope and occasionally crossing the line, and then they have to be brought back into line and compliance. We know the Iranians have cheated on heavy water restrictions, and they're using centrifuge loopholes. But the president said, even more broadly than that, even more broadly, Iranian behavior is so horrible across the region that you simply can't say that sanctions relief is proportionate and appropriate. And so he failed to certify the Iran deal. Now, this was broadly reported. This was reported everywhere as he said that Iran's not complying with the deal. No, he didn't. There's no debate about this. This isn't up for debate. It's not up for interpretation. There's no debate about this. He did not say that the Iranians are not complying with the deal. What he said is that sanctions relief is no longer proportionate and appropriate. Now, a lot of people say, well, then what does that have to do with the deal? And the answer to that is, well, Congress says that has everything to do with the deal. That if the deal's not worth it, that if we got too little, and we gave up too much, it's not worth it. That's what Congress asked. Now, there's a technical thing that happens now, which is now that he has said to Congress, you know what? In my assessment, the deal's not worth it. I can't certify the deal. Congress has the opportunity to act on the deal again, and we'll talk in a little bit about what that does, because that's actually what's going to start happening. But it's important for people to understand what has already happened. And what has already happened on the nuclear side, as part of this really broad policy, the nuclear part of it is he was asked by Congress every 90 days, in a law, is sanctions relief proportionate and appropriate? And he said, no, it's not. That's what he said on nuclear. Now on non-nuclear. This is the other part of their new policy. They had an obligation under a different law, the administration did, to what's called designate, to find that the entire IRGC, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that is what the Iranians say are the custodians of their revolution. Congress told the administration that they had to what's called fully designate the IRGC as a terror group, as a terror organization. Now, there are a couple ways to do that. One way to do that in the United States, if you have a group that is a terror entity and you want to say so, you can use what's called the State Department route. And when the State Department makes somebody a terrorist group, they declare them a foreign terrorist organization, what in technical language is an FTO. That's not what they did. There's actually another way to make a group a terror entity, and that is to have the Treasury Department, not the State Department now, the Treasury Department, extend an executive order to them, Executive Order 13224, and to say that the whole group is a terror entity. The executive order was created after 9/11. This is an executive order about terrorism, and that's what the administration did. They extended the executive order about terror groups to the entire IRGC. That effectively says that the entire IRGC is a terror group. That's what it means. And Congress told them to do it by the end of October, and indeed they did it. This has enormous consequences for the ability of companies to do business in Iran. You know, we still have sanctions on Iran. Americans are prohibited from doing almost all trade with Iran. But the nuclear deal shredded international sanctions so that companies elsewhere can do it. But there's an exception. Even if you're allowed to do trade with Iran, America still prohibits people from doing trade with terrorists. So if you do business with us, you're not allowed to do business with terror groups. And if we catch you doing business with terror groups, you get cut off or fined from our market. That's true if you're a bank, if you're a company, no matter what. What this did, this move that the administration made to extend the executive order to the IRGC, what it did is it told anybody anywhere in the world, you can do business with us or you can do business with the IRGC, but you can't do business with both. And the way that this becomes real is the IRGC controls enormous parts of Iran's economy. There are some parts of Iran's economy that they control almost entirely, but they control enormous parts of the Iranian economy. And now, people really are on notice that if they want to do business with Iran, they better be extra careful, what's called enhanced due diligence, to ensure that they're not benefiting the IRGC. It's an enormously important thing. And the reason the administration did it is because they assess that even when you're talking about Iran, one of the world's worst regimes. The IRGC is a disproportionately bad actor inside the disproportionately bad regime, the IRGC regime in Iran. And so that's what they did on non-nuclear. They're really going to start pushing back against the IRGC, and the president discussed that extensively in his speech. This was also misreported. Just like there was broad misreporting about the president saying that Iran's not complying with the deal, which isn't what happened at all. There was misreporting that said that the administration stopped short of fully designating the IRGC. It's not true. And again, this isn't a place where there's a debate. Iran is a tangled issue. There's debates all over the place. This is not one of them. There are two ways to designate a group, the State Department way and the Treasury way. They did it the Treasury way. And so, what happens now? What the next few months will be, the president will be implementing the nuclear and non-nuclear things that he did. Now, when it comes to non-nuclear, we know what's going to happen. They're going to go after the IRGC. The nuclear stuff is much more complicated. When the president said that the deal's not worth it, he pointed to 3 specific flaws in the deal. One specific flaw that made him say the deal's just not worth it is that the verification mechanisms in the deal are terrible. There's entire parts of the deal that the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, simply can't or has not verified. For instance, one that gets talked about a lot is what's called Section T, which is a bunch of prohibitions against Iran developing nuclear weapons technology. This isn't about uranium. This is about things like computer models of nuclear detonations that are very, very hard to detect. The UN's nuclear watchdog has been unable to verify that Iran is implementing that part. Huge verification problems, including we can't get into military sites and so on. That's one fatal flaw in the deal that the president said it's just not worth it. Fatal flaw number 2. Iran is allowed to continue building ballistic missiles even while we have to shred the international sanctions regime under the deal. The president has said that that's not much of a deal. That if the Iranians are allowed to get billions and billions of dollars while building ballistic missiles, not much of a deal. And then the third fatal flaw is what's called the sunset provisions. The deal expires. Everybody famously knows the deal expires, and Iran will have a full-blown legal nuclear program that puts them a hair's breadth away from a nuclear weapon under the deal if it's not fixed. So the president said to Congress, listen, I'm going to decline to certify on the questions that you asked me. You asked me, is the deal worth it? The deal's not worth it. Now you, Congress, have a chance to blow up the deal. But I don't think you should blow up the deal yet. Instead of blowing up the deal, try to fix the deal. You have these 3 fundamental flaws: verification, ballistic missiles, sunset clauses. See if you can rewrite American legislation, American law, to somehow deal with these. And that's what we're facing now in Congress. Congress, over the next couple months, will try to pass legislation that tells the Iranians either address these concerns or we're getting out of the deal. That's where the action is right now. Congress will work on these 3 things. It will try to pass legislation. The legislation in the Senate is sponsored by Senators Corker and Cotton, and that's what people should be looking out for, is does that legislation make progress through the Senate, this legislation that looks to fix the deal, fix the flaws that caused the president to conclude this deal's just not worth it. And the president said something really dramatic and really specific and really important in his speech. He said that we'll now work with Congress and with our European allies on those 3 flaws. And if the flaws get fixed, the United States will stay in the deal. If the flaws don't get fixed, we'll have to reevaluate our position in the deal. Because while those things are in there, the lack of verification, the ability to build ballistic missiles, the eventual expiration of the deal, while those things are in there, it's just not a deal worth having. And that's where we are going into the next few weeks. So Congress now is going to work on fixing the flaws. They have 60 days to easily blow up the deal. It doesn't look like they're going to do that. But the clock that they're talking about, when you talk to congressional insiders, they talk about a 90-day clock. What do they mean by a 90-day clock? Well, we already talked about how every 90 days the president has to answer those 4 questions, and he'll have to answer them again if Congress doesn't amend the legislation. But more importantly, every 120 days, the president has to do what's called the technical waiver extension. He has to decide every 120 days whether to snap back the sanctions that the U.S. lifted under the deal. Another way of saying this is every 120 days the president has the opportunity to completely withdraw the U.S. from the deal. There's some nuance, there's some technicalities, but the way to understand it is every 120 days the president has to decide whether to keep the U.S. in the deal. And both of those things happen in the middle of January. So the clock that is, what's called the certification clock, the clock for Congress blowing up the deal, that's a 60-day clock. But one of the things the president said during his speech, and it didn't get the attention it should have, is he said, listen, everyone knows this, but it's worth repeating, that the president can exit this deal at any time he wants. He just has to reimpose sanctions. He can wake up one morning and say, you know what, this process has gone on long enough. No one seems eager to fix the deal. The deal is unacceptable, is not in America's interest as long as it's unfixed. And he can just reimpose sanctions. But the realistic political clock, what is Congress talking about? What are they looking at is what's called right now a 90-day clock that expires sometime in the middle of January, January 15-ish, where the president has to, within a couple days of these two decisions are a couple days of each other, decide whether or not to again decline to certify, to tell Congress the deal isn't worth it, and whether or not to keep the U.S. in the deal. So think of what might be happening in the middle of January. If Congress and our European allies haven't worked with the Trump administration to fix the deal, then at the same time, the president will very likely conclude that the deal still isn't worth it, and he'll have to decide at the same time whether to keep us in a deal that he says is not worth it. And if Congress and our European allies haven't made progress, haven't worked with the administration through then, the president said this in his speech. This isn't a prediction. It's not a threat. The president said that he has the authority to withdraw the U.S. from the deal at any time, and that the process can't go on forever. It won't be an indefinite process. So that's really the other way to look at the congressional efforts. It's not just are they fixing the deal, are they moving fast enough to fix the deal, or is the president going to conclude that this deal, which he knows is one of the worst deals the U.S. has ever made, whether he'll keep the U.S. in it or not?